In this video, we are going to compare 3 paint jobs with significantly different time investments, and I'll give you my ideas for how to speed up your painting and how to create better looking minis at the same time. What's up, fellow pigment pushers? I hope you're doing fine, and I hope you can paint as much as you want to. Personally, I had a bit of a rough month. I was in a bit of a painting slump, which I think was induced by going full-time content creator with all the motivation in the world, but without taking a break after which was probably the hardest year of my work life. Teaching as a day job during COVID and doing YouTube and Patreon videos at the same time on the side. So even though I was super motivated in the beginning and cranked out a lot of videos, it turned out that I was exhausted and that I needed a break. So I took that break, but it still took a while to get back into that painting mood for some reason. So what I'm doing when I'm in this mood is I assemble minis, lots of minis. But that's not the topic of this video. See, something that I like to do when I'm not able to paint or when I'm not in a painting mood is to think about painting and painting theory. For example, what is it that makes a good paint job? I realized that I painted 3 blood angels during my time on YouTube, each of them with a different focus in mind, and because of that they all took a very different time frame to paint. And I thought it would be interesting to compare them and to see why one took longer than the other and how that makes them look really different. All of this started out with silly comments and people saying that I cannot paint quickly because I don't do it often on the channel. But let's not be silly here. I can paint a miniature in half an hour or an hour. Everyone can. All you need to do, for example, is use dry brushing and washes. But the question is, do you want to make this mini your mini, or are you happy with it looking like other dry brush miniatures? And there's nothing wrong with dry brushing. It's just kind of hard to make a miniature stand out if you're using a lot of basic techniques that everyone else uses. This is the reason why even in my speed paint, I went for techniques, for different approaches that put me at risk of failing the 30 minutes challenge. But I know that when we are thinking of really well painted miniatures, that there's something like a checklist that we are looking for subconsciously and consciously. And some items from that list are, for example, contrast, something that I have already expanded in another video. Most importantly, contrast of light, so value differences, light and darkness, highlights and shadows. Another thing is placement of light, and this can be as simple as just applying a zenithal base coat to simulate light coming from above. But there's a lot more complicated things to this, as we're going to find out. Another thing is color composition, something that is easy to think of but really hard to master, as we're going to see. Readability of the mini is how well did you separate all the items on the miniature from each other? How well are you guiding the eye of the viewer to where you want it to go? And how busy is your miniature, or how pleasant is it to look at your miniature without being stressed and having the eye wander? How easy is it to look at your miniature and read all the single elements and the story you want to tell, and so on. Smoothness of gradients is something that a lot of people find really important. Personally, I disagree, but we will look at this too. Next on the list we have level of detail, and last but not least, storytelling. And of course this list is not complete, and we'll get back to this list again later, but let's look at why this is interesting for the topic of this video. But before we continue, a few quick words about this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning platform with thousands of different classes on tons of interesting topics. Especially if you are a creative mind, you will love what Skillshare has to offer. For me, it was really easy to pick up the basics of watercolor painting, and it was fun to see so many different teachers on the platform with different styles and following along. The Skillshare library is massive. Just look at the videos on the topic of photography alone. And I know that there's a video for just about everything on YouTube, but these classes are taught by industry professionals, and the classes are built coherently and comprehensively, covering bigger topics in bite-sized chunks. If your time is limited, you can watch one part today and the other part another time, and you will easily be able to pick up where you left. Skillshare has helped me take better pictures with my smartphone, helped me with the software I use regularly, and there's even a couple of illustration classes taught by Jazza that I enjoyed a lot. Here you can see me applying everything I learned in my first watercolor class. But Skillshare does not only offer creative classes like painting, writing, animation and design, but they also cover business-related topics like marketing, career advice and how to build an online presence. Skillshare is absolutely worth it, and I'm happy that I can offer full access to the website to the first 1,000 people that use the link in the description. And yes, that means you can watch absolutely everything on the platform, and you're also supporting this channel in the process. Why not give it a try? We can attribute 2 factors to each item on that list: the impact it has and the time investment needed. For example, contrast has the biggest impact, but can also be achieved relatively quickly by using a wash, for example. As you can see when I apply a black wash to the eagle, we immediately get a lot of depth and the mini just simply looks better instantly. This is also the reason why washes are a really popular painting method, because it creates contrast instantly and you don't need a lot of practice to make it look satisfying. But if you never move beyond washes, is it going to be easy to tick all the other boxes we mentioned? Another example is color composition. It has a really large impact, which is especially noticeable if it's not done right. In that case, we're immediately put off. But it's not quite tangible how much time color composition takes. And all of a sudden we have another factor that influences all of this, and that is skill level and previous research. Someone that has spent a lot of time reading about color theory and that has deliberately practiced to come up with color schemes will probably take a few seconds to decide on a color combination, while someone that has not put in the research will have to think long about this and even might not come up with a good solution. So skill and experience is a factor that has an influence here. And not only will your results look better, if you know how to work with washes and if you know how to use them to create interesting effects, the time needed to create some of the items from our list is also going to go down. Like we showed, for example, with color composition. And at the same time, the impact goes up. That's why investing into learning and practice is always going to pay off later. Who would have guessed? There's a reason why Marco Frisoni's speed paints look significantly better than others, because he clearly knows his painting theory. And there's a reason why Squidmar's minis look impressive for how long he's been painting, because he focuses on the high impact things. So anyone that's starting out can paint a miniature in 30 minutes, and someone with experience will also be able to do that. But at the same time, it will probably look better. Impact goes up, time investment goes down. So let's compare the 3 blood angels I painted, and hopefully you can learn a thing or two while I go through the features on the list we mentioned and how taking more or less time to implement them influences the outcome. Whenever I want to be quick, I will do things that have high impact but have low time investment. I also try to create multiple steps at once. In this case, contrast paint helped me to create a main color, shadows and a bit of a highlight. This saved me applying a base coat, a wash on top, and having to highlight the edges somehow. If I didn't want to move super fast here, I would have probably spent about 10 more minutes on some edge highlighting. And most likely I would have used some sort of controlled dry brushing. Edge highlights have multiple functions. They increase contrast and guide the viewer's eye, which also helps with readability. And even though I did not add any highlights with a brighter red, and I stuck to the very subtle highlights created by the contrast paint, I knew I wanted to have a bit more focus on them. Edge highlights are a high impact thing we can do, but they also take a lot of time to do. That means I had to combine them with some other aspect from our list. So I decided to paint them on with metallics, which means I also created an extra level of detail by creating a chipped armor effect at the same time. It's pretty effective. You can see the edge literally stand out below the kneecap as I rotate the mini. A very extreme case of that is the bolter. There's no edge highlights beyond the metal paint I used, and it doesn't even have to be consistently covering all of the edge, just a few dabs and our brain creates the rest. I still wanted some sort of placement of light, so I decided to do it on a macro level, which means a global center light. But instead of making the higher up areas brighter, I'm making sure the lower areas are darker, which in turn makes the upper areas subjectively brighter. Smoothness of Gradients I kinda had instantly with the contrast paints. It's not the greatest value difference, it's more a subtle gradient, but everything depends mostly on how well the contrast paint does what it's supposed to do by only slightly staining the higher up areas. And we can definitely increase this effect by using a gloss varnish on top of the base coat, which I didn't do here. So what is this Mini still missing and what could have been improved? I think the thing it's missing the most is another black wash to flesh out the contrast better, instead of just using the dark red wash. Another relatively simple investment that would have had a big impact would be to add dust to the feet. This would tie together more with the base and would have increased the level of detail as well as a storytelling aspect. I don't really like to paint for speed. Actually, that's not correct. I don't like to paint with a time frame in mind. I still paint relatively quick these days, but I like to paint until I'm happy with the result. And the good thing is, there's things that take 10 minutes but improve the result a ton, like putting on a little dust or other high impact techniques we already mentioned. And once you figure them out, you always have them in your repertoire, but if you never experiment and always just do the basics, you might never find them. So what's different in the 5-hour version? I still didn't use any high precision painting to create the red armor, only a sponge and a ruined brush for a little more precision. But you can see that everything is painted with a lot more intent and have much more control over what is going on, while you're something like a passenger or at least a pilot with limited steering capacity on the speed paint with a time limit. Mostly because of how washes and contrast paint behave, you can always control them 100% and they have the limits of what you can create with them in just 1 or 2 passes. Especially the detail goes on in a much more controlled way. While I had to apply the brown chips and flake paint rather randomly on the speed paint, I could make sure the blackened paint would go on exactly towards the edges. And just look at the difference it makes when you're able to set up the chips and flaking properly versus not having the time to do that. The readability increases because panels are clearly divided already by the black, even more so after I applied the metal where the paint rubbed off. Darkening the edges is not the traditional bright edge highlights on darker panels, it's, well, the opposite, but in the end it's nothing more than a value difference in the right place, which creates contrast, and our brain likes that. It's really fun to experiment with changing up the expected and to see that it still works. The level of detail goes up significantly because the textured blending I did allows for a variation within the panels, also because I could treat the decals with a bit more care. And at the same time, we're able to tell a story because this is definitely a dude that has seen some stuff and is probably deep into a campaign that has demanded a lot from the gear and the human inside. And I even had time to think properly of my placement of light, like you can see on the kneecap and the black trim of the shoulder guards. Even though all the highlights are textured and rough, it still looks more credible than the contrast paint gradients. The biggest thing that happens in the progression from the first miniature to the second is that you can see a clear manifestation of style, an individual fingerprint of the person who painted this, which is not always possible with ways of painting that give you little control. And while I tried to do the same thing on a speed paint, I believe that you could tell 10 different painters to replicate what I did here and you would not be able to tell the difference. While on the grimdark one, you would maybe say, oh yeah, I kinda recognize your style here. Or you'd at least be able to tell 2 painters apart. So what could have been done better with more time investment? Honestly, I don't think that much. Why? Because I had a style in mind for this rather than a time frame. And what I did with the Mini was geared more towards achieving that style and only incidentally was relatively quick. At least once I had practiced the techniques involved and once I worked out all the quirks it had, like what dilution level of paint would be the fastest and so on. In my opinion, there's a valuable lesson to learn from this. The smartest thing to speed mini painting up is to set a limit of style instead of setting a limit of time. So in the last version, after we paid a lot of attention to readability and contrast, obviously the major thing that stands out is that I wanted to go into more depth with the material of the armor. I didn't take it as far as some of the other Space Marines I painted, but I wanted a reflective surface. And unlike dull and beaten up surfaces like the grimdark version, that means I need to control where every highlight and every secondary highlight goes. Yes, this is complicated and can be intimidating to learn, but controlling your highlights and reflections this way, to me, is the ultimate way to make a Mini your own version. something that has potentially never been painted that way, because you can also have the ambience reflect and interact with your main color. And it just opens up so many options to have fun with everything you learned about painting. Now we're diving deep into placement of light and level of detail. And I hope this illustrates that placement of light also has a spectrum of complexity, like I mentioned initially. It can go from a macro level and simple pre-shading of a zenithal light to multiple reflections on a shape and how light interacts with different surfaces, which is something that takes a lot of upfront skill building and research, like we mentioned before. But once you learned it, this offers a lot of fun and creative potential. So in the miniature, we still have a global light source, but that light interacts a certain way with the polished surface and creates distinct patterns. On top of these patterns, which create detail, I also went with scratches, and while we can of course be perfectly happy with just the highlight patterns, this creates more information, more level of detail, more storytelling by having more to look at and to explore on the menu. In my opinion, combining level of detail and storytelling is the second most impactful thing after creating the initial contrast when you want to make your miniatures better. It has a really high impact, but the difference to contrast is it also takes the longest time, because like I said, it takes a lot of research, a lot of practice, and of course it also really takes a long time to paint. If I had to push this even more, like if I tried to win a golden demon with this, I would probably try to show more that I'm able to paint a lot more detail than there is on the miniature. Maybe even more reflections, like I mentioned when I showed the other marine. And of course, the single biggest time sink when it comes to golden demons is to make sure that everything is neat and nothing on there looks like a mistake, which is the main way that they determine which miniature is better. And this is where smoothness of gradients comes in, which in my opinion is not that important a factor in most other painting scenarios. All in all, I think I like the grimdark paint job best because it allowed me to express creativity with a technique that still was decently quick to do, and yet it ticks a lot of the boxes we established with our original list. For the sake of tying that in with the topic of the video, I think it's a thing of the first 90% of a paint job taking significantly less time to do than the last 10%, for a lot of reasons we talked about in the video. On a personal experience level, I think the grimdark version is just something unique and fun to do, and it's going to be adaptable to a lot of different color schemes. And to me, that's what's exciting about miniature painting, finding new approaches, working out its quirks, and adding a new skill to my repertoire of abilities. So this was not necessarily a tutorial about how to paint miniatures, but more a tutorial about how to think about improving miniatures on all levels and all the factors that have influence on how we perceive a miniature. Factors that are not necessarily directly related to things like what paint gives the best coverage, what is the best paint to use for, or what is the quickest way to achieve a certain effect. I think it's still important to think about this, even if you have the feeling you don't need it, because you just want to get your army done quickly. But having all of these additional concepts at the back of your mind will ultimately help you to create a unique color scheme and unique armies that will make people jealous, and they'll start asking you what you did there and how you did it. And if you want to make your showcase miniatures even better or move into competition painting, hopefully now you have a new perspective and a goal to work towards by deliberately practicing things from the list. Thanks for watching. Don't forget that I have a Patreon that has even more tutorials for beginner and advanced painting stuff. And of course, any contribution on there goes a long way and helps me to create more of these free videos too. On screen you can see all the people that contributed on the video credits level. Thanks to all supporters across all of the platforms for allowing me to do what I do. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet to never miss an upload. And don't forget, don't be afraid, it's only paint.